HOA Karen planted drugs in my cabin. Thinking she'd finally found a way to destroy me, she had no idea I control both the sheriff and the judge. I discovered her little surprise on a Tuesday morning when I was checking the guest bedroom for some old files. There, wedged behind the nightstand in a spot that screamed amateur hour, was a small baggie of what looked like cocaine. My blood ran cold, not from fear, but from pure rage at the audacity. The placement was so obvious it hurt. Karen had clearly watched too many crime shows and thought she was some criminal mastermind. The powder was still fresh, the baggie new, and there were even her fingerprints smudged on the plastic. Amateur. I'd seen real evidence tampering cases during my 30 years on the federal bench, and this was laughably sloppy. I stood there holding that baggie, my mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This wasn't another HOA violation notice or a complaint about my fence height. Karen had just committed multiple felonies, and she was probably sitting in her McMansion right now, giddy with excitement, waiting to make her move. See, Karen Morrison had been the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates for 8 years. She ruled our little community with an iron fist wrapped in a fake smile and expensive yoga pants. Every homeowner lived in fear of her violation notices, her surprise inspections, her ability to make life hell for anyone who dared to paint their shutters the wrong shade of beige. But Karen had picked the wrong target this time. She'd been escalating her attacks on me for months, starting with petty complaints about my garden gnomes being aesthetically inappropriate and building up to accusations that my cabin-style home brought down property value. When I refused to cave to her demands to renovate or sell, she'd gotten desperate enough to frame me for drug possession. The irony was delicious. Karen thought she was dealing with some harmless retiree who'd fold under pressure. She'd done her research, sure knew I was a widower who kept to himself. Knew I'd moved here 3 years ago, seeking peace after my wife's death. What she didn't know was who I used to be. What she couldn't have possibly discovered through her neighborhood gossip network was that Judge William Hartford, the man she was trying to frame, still had more connections in law enforcement than she could imagine. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number: "Found something interesting in your house yet? Shame what happens to drug dealers in nice neighborhoods. Pack your bags, old man. Time to go." But here's what really made me smile. Karen had no idea that Sheriff Mike Rodriguez had been my bailiff for 15 years before taking this job. She didn't know that the current district judge, Sarah Chen, had been my law clerk fresh out of school. She couldn't possibly have guessed that half the law enforcement in this county owed their careers to recommendations I'd written, cases I'd handled, or mentorship I'd provided. Karen Morrison was about to learn a very expensive lesson about assumptions. She thought she was playing chess with a retirement home resident. She had no idea she'd just declared war on someone who'd spent 3 decades watching criminals exactly like her get what they deserved. I poured myself a bourbon, sat in my favorite chair, and started making phone calls. Karen wanted to play games with evidence? Fine. Let's see how she handled it when the game was played by someone who actually knew the rules. The hunt was about to begin, and Karen had just painted a target on her own back. Let me tell you why this quiet little community meant everything to me, and why Karen's scheme cut so deep. 3 years ago, I was Judge William Hartford of the Federal District Court, presiding over cases that made national headlines. Drug cartels, organized crime, corruption cases that sent senators to prison. That was my world for 30 years. I'd built a reputation as the judge criminals feared most, the one who never bent to intimidation or political pressure. Then Margaret got sick. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. In 6 months, I watched the love of my life fade away while I juggled chemotherapy appointments with court schedules. She made me promise something during those final weeks, holding my hand in that sterile hospital room, Bill. When I'm gone, Find somewhere peaceful. Stop fighting everyone else's battles and just live. So I did. I retired early, sold our house in the city, and found this perfect little cabin in Willowbrook Estates. It wasn't much to look at: rustic wood siding, a wraparound porch, garden beds where I could grow tomatoes like Margaret always wanted. The HOA listing said it was a transitional property that would need updates, but I loved it exactly as it was. It reminded me of the lake house where Margaret and I spent our honeymoon. The first year was blissful. I read books, learned to cook something other than microwave dinners, and actually slept through the night without dreaming about case files. My neighbors were friendly enough: waves across the fence, casual chats at the mailbox. I thought I'd found my sanctuary. Then Karen noticed me. It started small. A polite letter about my mailbox being non-compliant with community standards. Then a complaint about my vegetable garden being visible from the street. Each violation notice was typed on expensive letterhead, professionally worded, but with an underlying threat: conform or face consequences. I tried to be reasonable. I painted the mailbox. I moved the tomato plants behind a decorative screen. But Karen smelled weakness in my compliance, and like every bully I'd encountered on the bench, she escalated. The turning point came 6 months ago. I'd installed a bird feeder that Margaret would have loved, a simple wooden thing that attracted cardinals and blue jays. Karen showed up at my door with a clipboard and a measuring tape, claiming it violated the aesthetic harmony guidelines of our community. "Mr. Hartford," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern, "I know you're new here, but we have standards. This isn't some rural trailer park." She gestured dismissively at my cabin. "Frankly, your entire property brings down our values. Perhaps you'd be happier somewhere more appropriate." That's when I realized what this was really about. Karen didn't just want compliance, she wanted me gone. My modest cabin, my simple lifestyle, my refusal to bow and scrape to her authority, it all threatened her carefully constructed kingdom. The harassment intensified. Surprise inspections of my property. Complaints about my pickup truck being commercial-looking. A formal letter demanding I pressure wash my siding and replace my dated windows. Each demand came with the same implicit message: sell and leave, or we'll make your life hell. I could have ended it with a single phone call. One conversation with Sheriff Rodriguez about harassment, and Karen would have backed down immediately. But I was tired of using my old connections, tired of the power games that had dominated my career. I wanted to be just Bill, the guy with the bird feeder and the vegetable garden. That was my mistake. In my desire to leave the judge behind, I'd forgotten a crucial truth: bullies only understand strength. My attempts at peaceful coexistence had been interpreted as weakness, and Karen had grown bolder with each successful attack. The final straw came last month. I came home from grocery shopping to find Karen in my backyard with 2 other HOA board members, taking photos of my unauthorized garden shed. Not requesting access, just trespassing, documenting violations, treating my property like her personal domain. "Excuse me," I'd said, trying to keep my voice level. "This is private property." Karen barely looked up from her clipboard. HOA Covenant 15.7 grants access for compliance verification. "Your shed exceeds height limitations by 4 inches. She smiled that predatory smile I'd learned to hate. "That's a $500 fine, plus removal costs." Standing there watching her measure my shed like she owned it, I felt something crack inside me. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. This was about respect, about boundaries, about Karen's belief that she could do whatever she wanted to whomever she pleased. But I still tried the peaceful route. I attended HOA meetings, followed proper procedures, even offered compromises. Karen shot down everything with parliamentary procedure and bureaucratic double talk. She'd turned our community board into her personal tribunal, and I was always the defendant. So when I found that baggie of cocaine behind my nightstand, I wasn't just angry about the frame job. I was furious that my attempts at living quietly had been twisted into vulnerability. Margaret's peaceful sanctuary had become a battlefield, and Karen had just declared total war. This time, though, she'd picked the wrong battle. Karen didn't keep me waiting long. 2 hours after I found her little surprise, she was at my door with that triumphant gleam in her eyes that told me everything I needed to know. She stood on my porch in her designer tracksuit and diamond tennis bracelet, flanked by 2 other HOA board members like some suburban dictator with her enforcers. "William," she said, using my first name with deliberate familiarity, "we need to discuss a very serious matter that's come to the board's attention." I opened the door wider, gesturing them inside with the calm demeanor I'd perfected during 30 years of dealing with lying defendants. "Please come in. I assume this is about more than my unauthorized bird feeder." "Actually, William, this is about something far more disturbing." Karen pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over the screen. "The board has received reports of suspicious activity at your residence. Drug-related activity." "That's quite an accusation, Karen. I hope you have something more substantial than neighborhood gossip." "Oh, I do." She was practically purring now. "You see, concerned residents have reported strange smells, unusual visitors at odd hours. The board has a responsibility to investigate threats to our community's safety and property values." Bob shifted nervously. "Karen, maybe we should let the police handle." "The police will be involved," Karen cut him off, her voice sharp with authority. "But first, I want to give William here a chance to come clean, to do the right thing before this gets messy." I leaned back, fingers steepled in front of me, a gesture that had intimidated mob lawyers and corrupt politicians. On Karen, it had no effect. She was too drunk on her perceived victory to notice the warning signs. "And what exactly are you proposing I come clean about?" Karen exchanged a meaningful look with her companions, then fixed me with what she probably thought was a steely gaze. "I'm proposing you pack your things and put this house on the market. Today, a quiet sale, no questions asked, and everyone moves on with their lives." There it was. The extortion, delivered with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Janet actually gasped, finally understanding what kind of meeting she'd been dragged to. Bob took a step toward the door, clearly wanting no part of whatever Karen was orchestrating. "That's an interesting suggestion," I said carefully. "And if I decline this generous offer? Then I'm afraid the board will have no choice but to report our suspicions to the authorities." Karen's phone was still in her hand, thumb still hovering over the screen. "Anonymous tips about drug activity, you understand? Very serious business. The kind of thing that gets houses searched, arrests made. Even if charges don't stick, the scandal alone would be devastating." She paused, letting her threat sink in. "Property values, neighborhood reputation, your personal safety all at risk. Much better to avoid the unpleasantness, don't you think?" I stood slowly, walking to the window that overlooked my garden. Margaret's roses were blooming beautifully this spring, red petals bright against the morning sun. I thought about her final wish for me to find peace, about the quiet life I'd tried to build in her memory. "Karen," I said finally, turning back to face her, "do you know what I used to do for a living?" She blinked, thrown off by the question. "You're retired. Some kind of government work, I heard. 30 years as a federal judge. Organized crime, drug cases, corruption trials. I've seen every scam, every threat, every intimidation tactic you can imagine." I walked closer, watching her confident expression start to crack. "And what you just described? That's textbook extortion. A felony that carries serious prison time." Karen's face flushed red. "You can't threaten me. I'm just trying to protect this community from..." "From what, exactly? A retiree who grows tomatoes and feeds birds?" I smiled, the same smile I used to give defendants who thought they were smarter than the system. Karen, you've just admitted to planning to file a false police report. In front of witnesses. Bob was backing toward the door now, Janet right behind him. Karen, we should go. This isn't… No, Karen snapped, whirling on them. Don't you see what he's doing? He's trying to intimidate us. This is exactly the kind of criminal behavior I'm talking about. But her backup was already gone, the front door closing behind them with a soft click. Karen stood alone in my living room, phone still clutched in her hand, her perfect plan crumbling around her. Here's what's going to happen, I said quietly. You're going to leave my house. You're going to stop harassing me. And you're going to pray that whatever evidence you think you have doesn't blow up in your face. Karen's jaw tightened. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she'd written off as a harmless old man. You have no idea who you're dealing with, William. I run this community. I have connections, influence, power you can't even imagine. I walked to the front door and opened it. Karen, I've sent cartel bosses to federal prison. I've watched senators resign in disgrace rather than face my courtroom. Your HOA presidency doesn't scare me. She stormed past me, then turned on the porch steps. Make that call, she hissed, waving her phone. Report whatever you think you found. We'll see who the police believe a respected community leader or some recluse with a drug problem. As her car pulled away, I closed the door and leaned against it, adrenaline finally hitting my system. Karen had just shown her entire hand, and she had no idea how badly she'd miscalculated. She thought she was dealing with a powerless retiree. She was about to learn the difference between retirement and weakness. Karen made her move exactly 12 hours later. I was having my morning coffee when I saw the police cruiser pull into my driveway, and I'll admit, for just a moment, my heart rate spiked. Even knowing what was coming, even being prepared, there's something primal about seeing law enforcement at your door when you're supposedly the target. Through my kitchen window, I watched two officers get out of the car. The younger one I didn't recognize, probably new to the force. But the older officer stepping out of the driver's side made me smile into my coffee mug. Sheriff Mike Rodriguez, my former bailiff, looking official and serious as he approached my front door. I opened it before he could knock. Morning, Mike. Been a while. Mike's professional mask slipped for just a second, a grin breaking through. Judge Hartford. Should have known when I saw this address on the report. He gestured to his partner. This is Officer Davis. We received an anonymous tip about possible drug activity at this residence. Anonymous? I raised an eyebrow. How mysterious. Well, gentlemen, please come in. I assume you'll want to search the premises. Davis looked confused by my casual attitude, but Mike knew me well enough to catch the subtext. We'd worked together for 15 years. He understood when I was playing a longer game. Officer Davis, I interrupted gently, I waive my rights and consent to the search. Sheriff Rodriguez knows I have nothing to hide. I paused, meeting Mike's eyes. Well, nothing I put there myself. Mike's expression sharpened. In all our years together, he'd learned to read my signals, and that last comment told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't about drugs. This was about evidence tampering. We walked through the house methodically. I played the cooperative citizen, answering questions, offering to move furniture. Davis was thorough, but respectful, clearly following protocol. When we reached the guest bedroom, I hung back and let them discover Karen's handiwork. Sheriff, Davis called out, his voice tight with surprise. You need to see this. Mike crouched beside the nightstand, where Officer Davis was pointing. There it was, Karen's little baggie, exactly where she'd planted it. Mike's jaw tightened as he examined the evidence without touching it, and I saw the moment he realized what he was really looking at. Judge, he said carefully. "Do you have any idea how this got here?" "I have some theories, Sheriff, but I think you might want to process it for fingerprints before we discuss those theories." Davis was already reaching for his evidence kit, but Mike held up a hand. "Davis, call for backup and the crime scene unit. Full forensic processing." He looked at me with the expression I remembered from our courtroom days, the look of a lawman who just realized the case was bigger than it appeared. "Sir, this seems like overkill for simple possession. Officer Davis, this is either a very sloppy drug dealer or something else entirely. Given Judge Hartford's background and cooperation, I'm betting on something else." Mike stood, dusting off his knees. "And if it's something else, we're going to document every microscopic detail." That's when I heard the sound I'd been waiting for. A car door slamming in my driveway, followed by the click-click of designer heels on my walkway. Karen had come to watch her victory, unable to resist seeing me led away in handcuffs. Mike heard it too. "Expecting someone, Judge?" "Oh, I think our anonymous tipster just arrived to see how our information panned out." The doorbell rang, followed immediately by aggressive knocking. Mike and I exchanged a look, the same look we'd shared 1,000 times when a defendant was about to walk into a trap of their own making. "Sheriff Rodriguez?" Karen's voice carried through the door, dripping with fake concern. "I heard there was police activity. As HOA president, I wanted to make sure everything was all right." Mike opened the door, his expression carefully neutral. "Ma'am, we're conducting an investigation. I'll need to ask you to." "Is he being arrested?" Karen pushed past him into my living room, her eyes bright with anticipation. "I mean, I hope William is cooperating. Such a shame when these things happen in good neighborhoods." She was trying so hard to look concerned, but I could see the satisfaction radiating from her. This was her moment of triumph, the vindication of months of harassment and intimidation. "Actually, ma'am, we're still processing evidence. Can I ask your name for our report?" "Karen Morrison. I'm the HOA president and the person who called in the tip." She caught herself immediately, her face going pale as she realized what she'd just admitted. "I mean, I might have been one of several concerned residents who—" "So you're saying you called in this tip?" Mike's voice stayed professional, but I caught the slight emphasis on you. "And you had specific information about drug activity?" Karen's composure was cracking like ice on a warm day. "Well, there were signs. Suspicious behavior. It was my duty as a community leader to—" "What kind of signs?" Officer Davis had joined us, his notepad out. "What specifically made you suspicious?" I watched Karen realize she was walking into quicksand. She'd come here expecting to watch my downfall, but instead she was being questioned like a suspect. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. "I don't have to answer these questions. I was trying to help. If you're not arresting him, then clearly there was some mistake." "Oh, we're definitely making an arrest today," Mike said quietly. "The question is who?" Karen's face went through several color changes, red to white to green, as the implications hit her. She looked at me with dawning horror, finally understanding that her perfect plan had just become her perfect nightmare. "You can't prove anything," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. I smiled at her with the same cold patience I'd once shown mob bosses who thought they were untouchable. "Karen, in my 30 years on the bench, I learned that criminals always make the same mistake. They assume everyone else is as sloppy as they are." The crime scene unit was pulling into my driveway, and Karen's legs seemed to give out. She sank into my couch, staring at her hands as the full weight of her situation became clear. Sheriff Rodriguez was reading her rights, but I doubt she heard a word. She was too busy realizing that her war against the quiet retiree had just turned into a battle with the entire justice system. And she was losing badly. "Retry Next 48 hours were pure poetry. While Karen sat in county lockup on charges of breaking and entering, evidence tampering, and filing a false police report, I orchestrated the kind of systematic legal demolition that had made my reputation on the federal bench. The difference was, this time it was personal. My first call was to Sheriff Mike Rodriguez, who met me at the Copper Kettle Diner on Main Street, our old breakfast spot from the courthouse days. Mike slid a manila folder across the table as I ordered my usual black coffee and wheat toast. "Forensics came back clean as a whistle," Mike said, keeping his voice low even though the diner was nearly empty. "Karen's prints are all over that baggie, but the cocaine? Store-bought baking soda mixed with powdered sugar. Amateur hour doesn't begin to cover it." I flipped through the crime scene photos. She really thought this would work? Gets better. We pulled her phone records. 3 calls to the tip line over the past month, all from her number. Each one escalating the story first. It was suspicious activity, then strange smells. Then finally, I saw drug deals happening. Woman documented her own conspiracy. That was Karen's fundamental flaw. She'd spent so many years terrorizing neighbors who were too intimidated to fight back that she'd forgotten how evidence actually worked. In her mind, accusation equaled conviction. "What about the breaking and entering?" Mike's grin was predatory. "Your security cameras caught everything. Karen using a lockpicking set on your back door last Tuesday at 2:47 a.m. High-definition video of her planting the evidence, even got her license plate when she left. Security cameras. I'd had them installed after the first HOA harassment incident, though I'd never mentioned them to anyone. Old habits from 3 decades of dealing with people who thought rules didn't apply to them." "She confessed to making the tip call in front of witnesses," I reminded him. "Bob Chen and Janet Williams both gave statements. Said they had no idea what Karen was planning. Thought they were there for a routine HOA violation. Both are willing to testify that Karen threatened you with false police reports unless you sold your house." I sipped my coffee, savoring the moment. What's her bail situation? The pieces were falling into place beautifully. Karen's entire life was unraveling because she couldn't resist picking one more fight with someone she'd underestimated. My second call was to Judge Sarah Chen, not Bob's wife, but my former law clerk, who now presided over the district court. Sarah and I met at her chambers after hours, the courthouse quiet except for the cleaning staff. "Bill, this is awkward," Sarah said, settling behind her massive oak desk. "Karen Morrison's attorney is already crying judicial bias, claiming you're pulling strings. Am I asking you to do anything illegal or unethical? No, but am I asking you to ignore evidence or bend rules?" Sarah's expression hardened. She'd learned well during her clerk years. "No, you're asking me to do my job." Exactly. Karen Morrison committed multiple felonies against a private citizen. The fact that citizen used to be a judge is irrelevant to the law. I leaned forward. But her attorney's claims about bias, that actually works in our favor. How so? Because it establishes motive. Karen didn't target a random retiree, she specifically went after someone she saw as powerless. When that person turned out to have connections, she's claiming the fix is in. That's consciousness of guilt, Sarah. She knows she's guilty, so she's trying to make this about corruption instead of evidence. Sarah nodded slowly. The prosecutor already has enough for a conviction. 3 felony counts, video evidence, witness testimony, her own confession. What's Karen's lawyer offering? Plea bargain down to misdemeanor harassment, time served, community service. I shook my head. Sarah, that woman has terrorized an entire neighborhood for 8 years. She broke into my home, planted evidence, tried to frame me for drug possession, and extorted me to sell my house. A misdemeanor slap on the wrist sends exactly the wrong message. The prosecutor's worried about looking vindictive, Rich white woman versus powerful retired judge, bad optics. Then make it about the law, not the people. Karen Morrison committed serious crimes. Period. Her wealth and social status shouldn't protect her any more than my judicial background should condemn her. I stood to leave. But ultimately, it's your courtroom. I trust your judgment. That last part was crucial. I wasn't asking Sarah to punish Karen as a personal favor. I was reminding her that justice applied equally, regardless of who the victim or perpetrator happened to be. My third call was the most important one. I dialed the number for Marcus Webb, the county prosecutor who'd worked with me on dozens of federal cases before I retired. "Judge Hartford," Marcus said warmly. "Heard you were living the quiet life out in suburbia." Quieter than expected until recently. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer." "Shoot." "Are you planning to offer Karen Morrison a sweetheart plea deal because prosecuting her might look bad politically?" Long pause. "Bill, this isn't exactly a career-making case. Rich HOA president versus retired federal judge? The optics are challenging." "Marcus, in all our years working together, have I ever asked you to compromise your ethics?" "Never. But have I ever asked you to prosecute someone who didn't deserve it?" "No, but this is different. The media is already sniffing around, talking about abuse of power. The old boys network protecting its own." I let that hang for a moment. "Marcus, what if I told you this case could make your career instead of threatening it?" "I'd ask what you mean." Karen Morrison has been running a harassment campaign against multiple residents for years. We have documentation of at least 6 other homeowners who've been intimidated, threatened, or forced to sell because of her tactics. This isn't about me, it's about a serial bully who finally picked the wrong target. I could hear Marcus flipping through papers. "Go on. Prosecute this case properly, and you're not the guy who went after a housewife to help his judge friend. You're the prosecutor who stopped a neighborhood tyrant from destroying more lives." That's a story the media can get behind. And if I take the plea? Then Karen learns that wealth and connections can buy her way out of consequences. And the next retiree who moves into a community she wants to control won't be as lucky as I was. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Bill, send me everything you have on her other victims. If this is bigger than one incident, the public needs to know." As I hung up, I felt the familiar satisfaction of a complex strategy falling into place. Karen had declared war on what she thought was a defenseless old man. Instead, she'd attacked someone who understood exactly how the system worked and had the relationships to make it work properly. The hunter had become the hunted, and Karen was about to discover that some prey bite back. The courtroom was packed the morning of Karen's arraignment. Word had spread through Willowbrook Estates, and beyond the HOA queen, who'd terrorized an entire community, was finally facing justice. I sat in the back row, watching Karen's perfectly styled world crumble in real time. She walked in wearing a conservative navy suit, her lawyer whispering urgently in her ear. But I could see the cracks in her armor, the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted around the courtroom like a trapped animal. This wasn't the confident predator who'd stood in my living room making threats. This was someone who'd finally realized the cage door had slammed shut. Judge Sarah Chen called the court to order, her voice carrying the authority I'd taught her years ago. The people versus Karen Elizabeth Morrison. Multiple charges including breaking and entering, evidence tampering, filing false police reports, and extortion. Karen's attorney, a slick-looking guy named Patterson, who probably charged $500 an hour, stood immediately. "Your Honor, we'd like to address the elephant in the room. My client is being prosecuted because she had the misfortune of targeting a former federal judge with extensive connections in local law enforcement. I had to admire his strategy When the facts are against you, attack the process. But Sarah didn't flinch. Mr. Patterson, are you alleging prosecutorial misconduct? I'm suggesting that ordinary citizens don't get this level of investigative attention for simple HOA disputes. That's when Prosecutor Marcus Webb stood up, and I knew Karen was finished. Marcus had that look, the expression of a hunter who'd cornered wounded prey. Your Honor, the defense's claims about special treatment are particularly ironic, given the evidence we've uncovered about Mrs. Morrison's past behavior. Patterson went pale. Objection, Your Honor. Previous conduct isn't relevant to. Actually, Mr. Patterson, it is. Marcus opened a thick file folder. Your client has engaged in a pattern of harassment spanning multiple neighborhoods and several years. We have documented evidence of similar intimidation tactics against at least 8 other homeowners. Karen's head snapped up, her composure finally cracking completely. She'd thought this was about one incident with one victim. She hadn't realized that her other victims had been quietly documenting her behavior for years, just waiting for someone brave enough to fight back. Mrs. Henderson from Pine Valley Estates, Marcus continued, reading from his notes, threatened with false safety violations until she sold her home at a loss. Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez from Oakwood Commons harassed with noise complaints and property damage accusations until they relocated. With each name, Karen sank deeper into her chair. Her perfect little world of controlled intimidation was being exposed to the light, and it was uglier than anyone had imagined. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger, this isn't about judicial favoritism. This is about a serial predator who finally attacked someone with the resources to fight back. Mrs. Morrison has been running a sophisticated harassment operation for years, destroying families and stealing property values through intimidation and fraud. Judge Sarah leaned forward. Mrs. Morrison, do you understand the charges against you? Karen tried to speak, but only a croak came out. She cleared her throat and tried again. Your Honor, I was only trying to protect our community standards. If people would just follow the rules. Ma'am, Sarah interrupted, the rules don't include breaking into homes and planting fake evidence. They don't include extortion or filing false police reports. They certainly don't include the systematic harassment of law-abiding citizens. That's when Karen made her final mistake. The mistake that sealed her fate and proved everything I'd believed about her character. She looked directly at me, her face contorting with rage, and screamed, "This is all his fault. He moved into our neighborhood and refused to respect our standards. I was protecting property values. I was protecting our way of life." The courtroom fell silent. Even Patterson looked horrified at his client's outburst. Karen had just confessed to everything: the harassment, the targeting, the belief that she had the right to drive people from their homes if they didn't meet her personal standards. Judge Sarah's gavel came down like thunder. Mrs. Morrison, you will control yourself in my courtroom. But Karen was past control now, past the careful facade she'd maintained for so many years. You people don't understand? I built that community. I made it what it is. Some nobody retiree doesn't get to waltz in. And Mrs. Morrison, Sarah's voice cut through the rant like a blade. You have just confessed to targeting Mr. Hartford specifically because you wanted him to leave the neighborhood. That confession, combined with the physical evidence of your crimes, makes this case very simple. Marcus stood again. Your Honor, in light of Mrs. Morrison's confession and the evidence of her pattern of harassment, the people request that bail be revoked pending trial. Patterson jumped up. Your Honor, my client misspoke. The stress of your client confessed to a hate crime, Mr. Patterson. She targeted Mr. Hartford because she didn't believe he belonged in her community. That transforms this from simple harassment to a civil rights violation. I watched Karen's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and finally terror as the full implications hit her. This wasn't going to be a slap on the wrist anymore. This wasn't going to disappear with a plea bargain and community service. Bail is revoked, Judge Sarah declared. Mrs. Morrison will be remanded to county custody pending trial. Given the evidence of flight risk and the serious nature of these charges, particularly the civil rights implications, I see no alternative. As the bailiff approached Karen with handcuffs, she turned one last time to look at me. The predator was gone, replaced by something pathetic and broken. "This isn't over," she whispered, but there was no conviction in it. Just the desperate last words of someone who'd built her identity on power over others and was watching that power crumble to dust. I stood as they led her away, not in triumph, but in the quiet satisfaction of justice properly served. Karen Morrison had spent years believing that wealth and position put her above consequences. She'd just learned how wrong she was. Outside the courthouse, I was approached by 3 neighbors I'd never met, victims of Karen's previous campaigns, who'd driven down to watch her arraignment. They thanked me for doing what they'd never been able to do: stand up to the neighborhood tyrant. "She'll be back," one of them warned. "She always finds a way." I smiled, thinking about federal sentencing guidelines and the evidence Marcus had compiled. "Not this time," I said. "Not this time." Karen's trial, 3 months later, was a masterclass in legal devastation. I attended every day, not out of vindictiveness, but because I wanted to see justice completed. What I witnessed was the systematic dismantling of a predator who terrorized innocent families for nearly a decade. Marcus Webb had done his homework beautifully. He'd tracked down 12 of Karen's previous victims across 3 different neighborhoods, building an ironclad case of racketeering under the guise of HOA enforcement. The evidence was overwhelming: documented threats, property damage, fraudulent safety reports, and a pattern of targeting elderly or isolated homeowners who seemed vulnerable. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, an 83-year-old widow, testified about how Karen had filed 17 false violation reports in 2 months, claiming Eleanor's rose garden violated aesthetic standards. The harassment continued until Eleanor's children forced her to sell the home she'd lived in for 40 years, moving her to an assisted living facility she couldn't afford. James Mitchell, a disabled veteran, described how Karen had called code enforcement, claiming his wheelchair ramp was an unauthorized structure, then filed noise complaints about his service dog. The stress triggered his PTSD so severely that he'd attempted suicide rather than face another HOA meeting. The Patel family testified about Karen's anonymous complaints to immigration services, reporting them as suspicious foreign nationals after they declined to remove a small shrine from their front garden. The investigation found nothing, but the family endured months of scrutiny that their young children still have nightmares about. By the 3rd day of testimony, Karen looked like she'd aged 10 years. Her designer clothes couldn't hide the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone watching their entire life philosophy exposed as criminal harassment. Her attorney had tried everything: diminished capacity, community service plea bargains, even claims that she was the real victim of a conspiracy. None of it worked. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too established, the damage too extensive. But Karen had one final card to play, and she played it on the day before closing arguments. She somehow managed to post bail through a distant relative, and within hours of her release, she was back to her old tricks. I got the call from Sheriff Rodriguez at 6 a.m. on a Thursday. "Judge, you need to know Karen violated her restraining order last night. She was caught on security cameras trying to break into your house again." My blood ran cold. "Is she in custody?" "That's the problem. She ran when my deputies arrived. We found bolt cutters, a crowbar, and another baggie of fake drugs in her car. But she's in the wind." I dressed quickly and drove to the courthouse, my mind racing. Karen wasn't just desperate now, she was completely unhinged. A cornered animal with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous kind of criminal. I found Marcus in his office, looking haggard and furious. "Bill, I'm sorry. I thought she was broken after the testimony. I never imagined she'd be stupid enough to—" "She's not stupid," I interrupted. "She's calculating. Karen knows she's facing 15 to 20 years in federal prison. This is her last attempt to eliminate the witness who can tie everything together." "You think she's trying to kill you?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Should have taken the deal, old man. Should have just moved away quietly. Now you've destroyed everything, and I'm going to return the favor." Marcus read the message over my shoulder. "That's a death threat from a fugitive facing federal charges." This just became a manhunt. The next 12 hours were surreal. Federal marshals posted guards at my house, while tactical teams swept Willowbrook Estates. Helicopters circled overhead as K-9 units tracked Karen's scent through the wooded areas behind our community. They found her at 2:17 a.m., holed up in the abandoned construction site where the community had planned to build a new clubhouse. She'd been there for hours, watching my house through binoculars, waiting for the right moment to make her move. When they arrested her, Karen was carrying a loaded pistol, zip ties, and a detailed plan she'd written out on legal pad paper. The plan was methodical and chilling. Break into my house, force me to sign a confession saying I'd framed her, then stage my suicide to look like guilt over destroying an innocent woman's life. Reading that plan in the police report, I realized how completely I'd misjudged Karen's psychological state. This wasn't just harassment or intimidation anymore. This was the complete mental breakdown of someone who'd built their entire identity around controlling others and couldn't accept that the game was over. Her final court appearance was almost anticlimactic. Karen sat in shackles, her hair unkempt, her designer clothes replaced by an orange jumpsuit. The confident HOA president was gone, replaced by someone who looked broken and defeated. Judge Sarah didn't waste words. "Mrs. Morrison, your actions over the past week have demonstrated that you pose a clear and ongoing danger to the community. The court sentences you to 18 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, followed by 10 years supervised probation." Karen didn't react. She just stared straight ahead as if she couldn't quite process what was happening to her. But as they led her away, she turned to look at me one final time. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the silent courtroom, everyone heard her last words. "I just wanted things to be perfect. I just wanted everything to be the way it was supposed to be." That's when I finally understood Karen Morrison completely. She wasn't evil. She was someone who'd confused control with perfection, who'd believed that forcing others to conform to her vision would somehow create the ideal world she'd always imagined. The tragedy wasn't just what she'd done to her victims. It was that she'd destroyed herself trying to build something that could never exist, a world where everyone else bent to her will. As the courtroom emptied, I sat alone for a few minutes, thinking about Margaret's wish for me to find peace. Karen's reign of terror was over, but the cost had been enormous, not just for her victims, but for Karen herself. Sometimes justice feels like victory. Sometimes it just feels like waste. This felt like both. 6 months after Karen's sentencing, Willowbrook Estates had transformed into the peaceful community it was always supposed to be. The HOA dissolved itself within a week of Karen's conviction, with residents voting unanimously to replace it with a simple neighborhood association focused on genuine community building rather than authoritarian control. I was tending Margaret's roses on a quiet Sunday morning when Bob Chen approached my fence. The same Bob who'd fled my living room in terror when Karen made her extortion demands. He looked embarrassed, but determined. "Judge Hartford, I owe you an apology." "We all do." I straightened up, brushing soil from my hands. "Bob, you don't owe me anything. You were as much a victim as anyone else." "That's just it. We weren't victims. We were enablers." He gestured toward the street where other neighbors were emerging from their houses, clearly having planned this conversation together. We knew what Karen was doing to people. We saw the harassment, the intimidation, the families driven away. But we stayed quiet because it was easier than standing up to her. Janet Williams joined us at the fence, her face flushed with shame. "My husband and I talked about intervening so many times. When she went after the Patel family, when she targeted Mrs. Vasquez. But we were cowards. We let her destroy lives because we were afraid she'd come after us next." More neighbors gathered around people I'd barely spoken to during my 3 years here, all carrying the weight of their complicity. I realized this wasn't just an apology. This was a community trying to reckon with how they'd allowed a monster to flourish in their midst. "The thing is," Bob continued, "we told ourselves we were protecting the neighborhood. Karen convinced us that strict enforcement of rules would preserve our property values, keep out undesirable elements. We bought into her fear-mongering because it was easier than examining our own prejudices." I thought about Karen's final words in the courtroom, her desperate need for everything to be perfect and the way it was supposed to be. She'd weaponized her neighbor's natural desire for stability, turning it into a tool of oppression. "The real lesson here," I said carefully, "isn't about standing up to bullies, though that's important. It's about what happens when good people convince themselves that cruelty serves a greater good." Eleanor Martinez, from the corner house, nodded vigorously. She made us believe we were protecting something valuable. But what we were really protecting was our own comfort, our own privilege. We let her drive away anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of acceptable. I invited them into my backyard, where we spent the next 2 hours having the kind of honest conversation that should have happened years ago. They told me about the families I'd never met, the young couple with the autistic son who'd been forced out because their child's stimming behavior was deemed disruptive, the elderly black gentleman who'd endured months of harassment before selling at a loss, the single mother whose children's toys in the front yard had somehow become a safety violation. Each story was a small tragedy, a life disrupted by fear masquerading as community standards. Karen hadn't been operating in isolation. She'd been enabled by people who'd confused uniformity with harmony, control with safety. "You know what the worst part is?" Janet said, tears in her eyes. "Some of these families were our friends. We had barbecues together, our kids played together. But when Karen started targeting them, we stepped back. We let them face her alone because we were afraid of becoming targets ourselves." That's when I understood the true scope of Karen's damage. She hadn't just harmed her direct victims, she'd corrupted an entire community's ability to support each other, to stand up for what was right when it mattered most. "So what happens now?" Bob asked. "How do we make sure this never happens again?" I looked around at their faces, good people who'd lost their way, who'd allowed fear to override their better instincts. You already know the answer to that. You're here, having this conversation. You're acknowledging what went wrong instead of pretending it never happened. Over the following months, our neighborhood became something genuinely special. We started monthly potluck dinners, where everyone was welcome. We created a community garden where Mrs. Vasquez's rose varieties now bloom alongside vegetables from a dozen different cultural traditions. We established a neighborhood watch that actually watches out for each other rather than looking for violations to report. Most importantly, we made a pact. Never again would we allow fear or prejudice to drive away our neighbors. Never again would we mistake conformity for community. I still think about Karen sometimes, especially when I'm working in Margaret's garden. I wonder if she understands what she lost, not just her freedom, but the chance to be part of something beautiful instead of something destructive. She could have used her organizational skills and community influence to build bridges, to create genuine connections, to help people flourish. Instead, she chose to rule through fear, and in the end, that fear consumed her completely. The lesson isn't just about standing up to bullies, though that's crucial. It's about recognizing the difference between leadership and domination, between community standards and community destruction. It's about understanding that true neighborhood strength comes from diversity and inclusion, not from driving away anyone who doesn't fit a narrow mold. If you're facing your own Karen, whether it's in an HOA workplace, a social group, or anywhere else, remember this. Bullies only have power when good people stay silent. They count on your fear, your desire to avoid conflict, your assumption that someone else will handle the problem. But here's what I learned from 30 years on the federal bench and 3 years in suburbia. Justice delayed is justice denied. And community health depends on everyone taking responsibility for the community's character. Don't wait for someone else to stand up. Don't assume the victim deserves what's happening to them. Don't tell yourself that staying quiet is safer in the long run. Because the truth is, there's no safe haven when tyrants are allowed to flourish. Eventually, they come for everyone. Stand up. Speak out. Document everything. And remember, even the most powerful bullies are just frightened people who've chosen control over connection. They can be stopped, but only if we stop them together. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more real-life justice stories. And tell me in the comments, have you ever faced a community bully? How did you handle it? Let's build a community where everyone knows they're not alone in these fights. Because that's what bullies fear most, people who refuse to stand alone.